the moral universe of the Old Testament. Okay? Material comfort is not at the top of the list of moral goals. And I think it's really important to kind of recognize this. Another thing that characterizes the West is almost a kind of radical individualism. Okay, you have your truth and I have mine. You live out who you are and I'll live out who I am, and so long as we're not like shooting at one another, that's how the world should be. Okay? In other words, there's no sort of like one standard that under which everyone should live, so long as we don't kill one another. Okay, that's the moral universe that we live in. And once again, the Old Testament is very different, more profound, because the Old Testament's moral universe begins with the presupposition that human beings were created in the image of God. And there is one standard that all of us should live under to become real, true human beings, and we actually can't do that apart from a relationship with our Creator. Okay? And that's probably illustrates another difference. Right? Once again, in the modern secular West, right, we talk about religion, and religion is fine for, if that's your thing. Right? If you're spiritual or religious, that's great, so long as you don't interfere with anybody else. And as long as that's your thing, hey, you go ahead and do it. The Old Testament assumes that actually you and I can't really be fully, truly, and authentically human apart from a relationship with God, because that's how we were made. Okay, so once again, it's a really different moral universe, and it's a moral universe, obviously, that launches the New Testament, and we'll see how that works later on. So that's one thing. A second thing about this moral universe is this. Sometimes, people do something that you really should not do. They're trying to solve some moral problem, and so they go rummaging through the Old Testament, and they kind of land on some verse, and they're like, this is what we should do. Well, that's not the best thing to do, because one of the things that we find here in the Old Testament is that God's beginning to shape and form a holy people. But that process isn't complete until Christ. Okay, so one of the things we find in the Old Testament is God begins to reshape some of the fundamental cultural values of the ancient Near East, but that reshaping isn't complete until we get into the New Covenant. So we just have to be careful of that, right? So we have all kinds of people today that, read the Old Testament and say, hey, the Old Testament seems to support slavery, or it doesn't sort of demand that women be equal to men and things like that. Well, no, not explicitly. But it begins to it begins to readjust those two things in new ways. But it's sort of launching a path. A good example here is, we'll see later on when we get to the book of Deuteronomy, the Old Testament doesn't abolish slavery, but it does limit slavery to a period of 7 years. That is, in effect, right, the Old Testament takes what many assume to be a sort of a fundamental institution of the world, slavery, a fundamental institution of the economy, slavery, and basically limits it. And in limiting it, right, it's a way of saying, you know what, this thing is not essential, it's not even actually proper. We'll put a limit on it. Okay, so we'll see things like this. So let's take a look now at Numbers 5, 1 through 4. We've seen a little bit, this is about purity and impurity. And I'll read it to you, and then I'll just say a couple things about it. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command the people of Israel that they put out of the camp everyone who is leprous and has a discharge, and everyone who is and everyone who is unclean through contact with the dead. You shall put both male and female, putting them outside the camp, that they may not defile the camp, in the midst of which I dwell. That's the really important part here. And the people of Israel did so and they put outside of the camp, as the Lord said to Moses, so the people of Israel did. So we've seen this when we walk through the book of Leviticus, this distinction between the clean and the unclean. And to us, it sounds kind of strange. But once again, we want to kind of get back into the moral universe of the Old Testament and see what's going on here. So here's the idea. Anything that's associated with death or corruption or decay is considered to be unclean. Leprosy, various kinds of bodily discharges, contact with a corpse. The idea here is that anything that's somehow associated with death or corruption or decay is considered unclean, and therefore those things need to be sort of separated out from Israel. Why? Because, and this is this verse that I emphasized just a minute ago, why does that need to be the case? Because God is actually dwelling in the midst of these people. Now, this may sound strange to us, but I think what we need to see the kind of where this is going. That is, what's going on here? In Israel, separating out anything associated with death or corruption or decay is looking forward to the new creation when those things are no longer present. That is, where did death, corruption, and decay come from? Were they an original part of creation? No. They were introduced by human sin. And so in this kind of clearing out of the unclean, the separation out of the unclean, what's going on now is we're sort of getting like a sort of a look forward to what creation might be like if it were fully restored to its original purity. Now, this idea actually is still kind of with us in the New Testament. Let me read to you a passage. This is Revelation 21:37. So that's almost the end of the book of Revelation. And we're getting a description of the New Jerusalem, which has come down from heaven, a city in which God is going to dwell with people. And it's Revelation 21:27. I can't read my own writing. My third grade teacher said that I would be a doctor because my handwriting is illegible. Here's what it says. This is the comment about the New Jerusalem. But nothing unclean will ever enter it, the New Jerusalem, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. So in the New Jerusalem, in which God comes to dwell with human beings, in which creation is restored to its perfect purity, there's no death, there's no corruption, there's no decay, and there's no sin. And so the life of Israel actually is designed to kind of look forward to that when it comes, the New Jerusalem that we took a look at. So that's one piece of this moral universe. Now, a second piece comes in Numbers 5 through 10. And here we're getting something that's really, really important. We'll see it again and again and again. It can't be emphasized too much. This has to do with what happens when people break faith with one another. That is, when someone does something that harms someone else. Here's what Numbers has to say about that in Numbers 5 through 10. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, when a man or a woman commits any of the sins that the people commit by breaking faith with the Lord, and that person realizes his guilt, he shall confess his sin that he has committed, and he shall make full restitution for his wrong, adding a fifth to it and giving it to him to whom he did wrong." Isn't that interesting? So notice two things about this passage I think that are really important. The point right here is that when, Joe here does something injurious to Fred. Okay, let's just use a simple example. Let's say that Joe here, is looking over at Fred's sheep herd and says, Fred's sheep are really good. They're better than mine. And he's got like a lot of them. So you know what? He probably won't like miss if I like take 2 or 3. And so Joe takes 3 of Fred's sheep. Okay, so Joe has wronged Fred, right? He's stolen some of Fred's sheep. Notice how Numbers thinks of this. Numbers thinks of this not as Joe has done something wrong to Fred, but what has Joe done? Joe has done what? He's broken faith with who? The Lord. Now, this is like a really, really important point. That is, the Old Testament here sees the wrongs that we do to other people, not just sort of as, ethical lapses. And Joe's harmed Fred, and, okay, yeah, well, that happens every day. No, the Old Testament sees the injury that one person does to another as that person breaking faith, breaking covenant with God. And therefore, it's serious. Now, this, of course, gets translated into the New Covenant, right, where, and we kind of remind ourselves of this every Sunday, right? All the sins that we commit, whether they're like internal sins or sins we committed against other people, against whom are we really committing those sins? God. And that's what makes it serious. Okay? That's why we have that confession of sin, right, every Sunday, is that we're acknowledging to God that we have sinned against him. And therefore, we need his forgiveness. And then, here's what has to happen. So, Joe has done something wrong to Fred. Now, what Joe needs to do now is, he needs to do a couple things. 3 things, actually. Thing number 1, he needs to go to Fred and confess what he did. Fred, I stole 3 of your sheep. And this is where things get really interesting, right? It's not just enough to apologize. Okay, that happens all the time in our culture, right? Something goes wrong in some organization, and the head of the organization will usually come out for some press conference and say, I can assure you that all responsibility stops at my desk. And what that means is that people lower down the ladder are going to get fired. That's usually what that statement means, right? That is, it's not enough to apologize. What has to be done now is Joe has to make restitution to Fred. And what that restitution involves is make restitution adding a 5th to the restitution. So just think about it this way, okay? Fred, I'm sorry, and I'm returning the 3 sheep that I stole, and I'm also giving you a 4th. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm reminding myself that in sinning against you, I sinned against God. Right? So the goal here, right, is to have Fred and Joe now reconciled. That's the goal here. And then the other thing that Joe needs to do is he then needs to go and make a sin offering in which he acknowledges his sin to God and then receives atonement or forgiveness for what he's done. Now, I think that there's a simple way to illustrate what's going on here. That is, one of the things that's going on here in Israel that's really important is God's law is working to establish what you might call a society of mutual responsibility, right? A society of mutual responsibility as opposed to a society of litigation, which is the society we live in, right? We live in a society, right, where there's the declining sense of mutual responsibility manifests itself in courts that are packed with all kinds of cases, most of which probably don't need to go there anyway, right? What God's law is attempting to do is it's attempting to sort of create a society of mutual responsibility, right, in which people sort of sense a kind of sense of duty to the people that live near them, right? A sense of mutual responsibility and mutual accountability. Community, right? That's what the law is designed to sort of like create. is that kind of social bond in which, right, it's not that Fred then is going to have to take Joe to court. And, this long drawn-out procedure where finally it's proven that, yes, Joe really did steal 3 of Fred's sheep. And then, Joe gets sentenced to, a certain amount of time in jail or some fine or something like that. The issue may be resolved, right, but the relationship between Joe and Fred certainly isn't. What's going on here is God's law is attempting to establish the kind of society in which people sort of sense this sort of strong bond of responsibility and mutuality between one another. So that's really important. And then finally, in chapter 5, we have a long section about, and this is kind of an interesting section here. It starts at 5:11. It involves a test for adultery. Now that may sound kind of odd. It may remind you of like a test for the flu or a test for COVID, or that you would like get in the drugstore or something like that. The situation that's being dealt with here in 5:11 through 31 is a case where a man suspects that his wife might be unfaithful to him. And in the process of that happening, right, he starts to get like angry and suspicious, right? And of course in our day, right, he'd probably hire a private investigator to, follow his wife around and all kinds of stuff. Who knows where that would go. And so what's proposed here is a test to determine whether adultery has taken place or not. Now, 2 things about this are really important. I would not suggest that this test be repeated or something, or be used today. And maybe that's really not the intention. 2 things that need to be pointed out here that I think are really significant. Thing number 1, notice what's going on here. We have something that I just mentioned. We have the Old Testament now kind of doing a sort of adjustment process. The fact that we have a test for adultery means that the determination of the wife's unfaithfulness does not rest with the husband's suspicion or anger. In other words, right, let's go back to Joe again. Let's say Joe now suspects that his wife is having an affair with Fred. Okay? And Joe, gets angry, and, Joe's kind of suspicious anyway, and so, he's kind of teetering over the edge. And so the idea right here is Joe gets to the point, right, where he thinks that his suspicion alone is grounds for making a judgment that his wife has been unfaithful. This prevents that from happening. Okay? Now, another thing I think that needs to be pointed out, and this is something that we'll see later on, it's really important to notice that the Old Testament thinks and presents God's relationship to Israel as a marital relationship. Probably the best and most condensed place to see this is in the book of Hosea, where Israel is being like really, really unfaithful to God. And so God tells the prophet Hosea to go and to marry a prostitute. And the purpose of doing this, right, is to sort of dramatize Israel's unfaithfulness. God is the faithful husband, and Israel is the faithless wife. That's how this marriage relationship has worked out. Now, this is really relevant because between Numbers 10 and 21, between the 10th chapter of Numbers and the 21st chapter of Numbers, and we'll walk through this, Israel breaks faith with God in a major way 7 times. And that number is not just random, right? 7 is the number of completeness, like the 7 days of creation. That is, the point of Numbers 10 through 21 is that on her journey to the promised land, essentially, Israel completely breaks faith with God. Now, we've seen this before, right? Back in Exodus 32, we saw the people of Israel at the bottom of Mount Sinai, and we saw that as the first commandment was being given at the top of the mountain, it was being broken at the bottom with a golden calf. And so the question here is, well, what is God doing with Israel who has broken faith with him? As a matter of fact, in Numbers 14:11, God sort of issues this cry, one might even think of it as a complaint about his people. How long will this people despise me? How long will they not believe in me in spite of all the signs that I have done for them? But as God has seen his people kind of be faithless over and over and over. And God says, we know why. I brought them out of Egypt. I've sustained them in the wilderness. I brought them to Mount Sinai. I gave them this covenant. I dwell with them. What have I done wrong? Okay? Why do they keep being unfaithful to me? And of course, what happens is, and here's the important part, right? God, the husband here, does not simply send his unfaithful spouse away, but in effect perseveres with her over and over and over and over. And this brings us, I think, to a really important passage. I think one of the most important passages in the New Testament. And here's where we'll have to stop. It's Ephesians 5:25. It's one of the scripture readings for the marriage liturgy, appropriately. And this is what Paul says. He admonishes husbands to, quote, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and did what? Gave himself up for her. That is, in effect, right, what we're being told is, and now we can sort of see it now in hindsight, right? Christ's death on the cross, among other things, is helping us to see that God's love for his sinful people, which by the way, of course, includes us, right? That God's love for his sinful people is a love which is self-sacrificial in nature. It's a love that's designed and aimed always at the good of his people, despite their faithlessness. Okay? So what's going to happen, as we'll see, is that Israel is God's people not because of their faithfulness, but in spite of their faithlessness. That's a really important point to make. Okay, we'll stop there. What we'll do next Sunday is we'll start with chapter 6, and we'll say a little bit about this. It's interesting. It's called the Nazarite Vow, which is really important for a number of reasons, and I'll try and point some of those out next Sunday.